Yeah, so hey, hello, I'm David Denon. Today I'm talking to Will Kitchen, who's a film studies scholar in England. He's written a book called Romanticism and Film, which hopefully you can see here. A lovely cover. And we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the ideas in the book. So, do you want to say anything else about yourself before we get started? Like, what are you,
Well,
like where you're teaching or anything like that?
sure. I'm Will Kitchen. I'm currently a teaching fellow in film studies at the University of Southampton. And yeah, Romanticism and Film was my first book, and it's basically based on my PhD. I was quite lucky to get it out straight away. So yeah, it's exciting to talk about it.
Yeah, and I've been curious. I don't think I've asked you before. Will and I have, know each other, so but I haven't. I don't think I asked you before how this project came about. Like, what got you interested in this? How it started?
Well, when you're thinking about a PhD, I suppose the best way to work on is to build on existing interests. I've always found that some of the most productive works you do are not something that's out of the blue, but something you realize you've been thinking about for a long time. You think, oh, I can turn this into an academic study as well. I've been a fan of Liszt's music for since about 2010. I first discovered him as an undergraduate, and I bought lots of CDs. I was a bit of a collector, and read Alan Walker's 3-volume biography. I joined the Liszt Society in the UK in 2013, and I've been a member ever since then. They have these annual piano recitals and annual dinners, and I used to go to some of those events. And I tried to teach myself Liszt's Piano Sonata in B minor. I'm a very amateur pianist, but that was a major challenge, and I managed to get most of it done, but I've forgotten most of it now. But yeah, this interest was already there as I was doing my undergrad and my MA studies. And so when it came to a PhD, there were certain connections that I wanted to, that I realized could link into what I've been studying as well. And these two worlds sort of came together in quite a nice way.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. And what? Of course, we'll talk maybe more about Liszt later because that's a big part of your book. But what drew you, do you think, to the music of Liszt in particular?
Obviously, a pretty personal taste, I suppose. I really like. I started out learning classical music with people like Debussy and Prokofiev, but it was quite a bit of a people build their identities, as Morse Peckham knew, by selecting certain things that interest them, and then they can use to distinguish themselves and build a sense of identity. So I was selecting between the bits of classical music that were my thing and the bits that weren't, and I took against Brahms and Schumann and the conservative side of the War of the Romantics, and more attracted to Liszt and Wagner, the more progressive side, and realized that these interesting personal tastes had kind of structural coherences that then you want to find out more about and how they sort of map together and relate to other things. So Liszt's music was obviously very focused on virtuosity and melody and dynamism, a sort of pianistic sense of structure and development. And it was quite scandalous as well, which made it stand out from the rather typically thought rather staid and boring world of classical music. It was a bit of an exciting, something rather different that obviously people like Ken Russell were keen to explore in their work. So again, the more I found out about it, the more I realized that these kind of things led to more interesting areas and perhaps weren't quite as simple as they first seemed. So it drew on that kind of sense of difference, really, primarily.
Okay. And yeah, we'll talk since your book is about romanticism and film, and of course Liszt plays a big part of that in that Wagner and also as well. Do you want to say a little bit about? I mean, what do you? How do you see romanticism as a cultural phenomenon?
Mm.
I mean, what's your idea about that?
Well, obviously, a big part of Romanticism, as we currently understand it, is the fact that it is there's this multiple fluid concept that's every book you pick up on Romanticism will have a different idea about what it's about. So it's really impossible to tie it down to any particular definition. And you pick up any of the standard works on Romanticism, you realize that rather quickly, that it is this mutable thing that everyone disagrees about. And that's part of what makes it exciting, that you can pull it in lots of different directions. And obviously, a big part of what Romanticism means to me today was derived from, as we are working on now, the work of Morse Peckham, who seems to provide one of the most convincing and engaging and exciting interpretations of Romanticism, basically. Some of the Northrop Frye, M.H. Abrams, those classical interpretations from the English academic tradition tend to pin it down to quite a specific area, which obviously has overlaps with various things. But Peckham saw Romanticism as this way of opening up some of the biggest questions that academic and philosophical problems that these kind of issues can ask, like the meaning of meaning itself and behavior, and the idea of having interests, and these really unusual, original, ambitious questions that Romanticism seemed to crystallize in lots of different ways. Obviously, a big part of Romanticism's mutability, and this fact that it is so expansive, is that it kind of seems a bit like what Karl Popper would call an irrefutable theory, a kind of an explanatory concept or form that you can apply to anything. And if you can do that, if it doesn't seem to have many limits, we've got to question whether it's really that useful. So it's the ongoing project that we seem to be having in lots of different works is how we use Romanticism and how we need to be careful about using it and what it can help us with and what it can't. But the fact that it has no boundaries and can open up these huge worlds of meaning and language and behavior, culture of all and art of all kinds, it does seem like something that it's so appealing because you can take it anywhere you want to.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things for me, and I think you do write about this in your book as well. I think you have a section on cultural transcendence, if I remember correctly. Yeah, the idea of cultural transcendence and kind of the problematizing of all our normal or conventional ways of thinking about things or explaining things, and trying to innovate new kinds of behavior was I think a key aspect of Romanticism that you can see continuing into the 20th century, and I would say people like Ken Russell, who you write a lot about in your book. I did want to.
Cultural transcendence seems like it's one of the big key issues in Peckham's writings on Romanticism, and it is probably the idea that he ties it down to quite a specific formulation in terms of taking that emergent behavior, building a group of followers, propagandizing it. It's quite specific the way he uses it, but in a more general term, I think it is very applicable in the ways you're talking about in terms of militating against the status quo, rejecting the world as it is. I think that's quite a useful way into Romanticism.
Yeah, I think so as well. And getting into film, it's an interesting, how Romanticism relates to film is a really interesting question. Film comes along kind of at the end of the 19th century, or early 20th century, after this long period of kind of romantic innovation, as well as other kinds of backlashes and so on, and kind of modernism, which in some ways grows out of Romanticism. And do you want to say a little bit how you see the beginning of film and film music? And you talk about how film composers tried to legitimate their work by referring back to people like Wagner. Do you want to say a little about? I thought it was a really interesting part of your book.
Yeah, it's there's a number of topics overlapping there again. I think that in terms of film coming along at the end of the Romantic century, basically, people tend to think of cinema as being the one of the big elements in the creation of the 20th century, modernity, modernism, the sort of emergence of technological progress and art and the interactions between them. The writings of famous and very influential scholars like Walter Benjamin were influential in saying that, building a cultural climate where film was received as the epitome of new, modern 20th century technology and its relationship with new emergent forms of culture. But as I say in the book, the important thing is to remember that although those explanations might have a lot of truth content, there's a very significant degree to which film is also developing and completing aesthetic trends that developed throughout the 19th century as well, in terms of the total work of art, the Wagnerian imperative to mix all of the genres together to create this total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk. The idea of film being the seventh art really comes from that 19th century tradition of mixing them together, that sense of multimedia inheritance and mixing, breaking the boundaries between artistic forms. And obviously, it then moves on to the technological side as well. But again, those are developing throughout the 19th century. The illusion of movement through various technological devices like the kinetoscope, they have strong links to 19th century traditions too. So the book begins with a kind of intervention in breaking that connection with thinking of the film, of cinema as the beginning of something, the beginning of what happened in the 20th century, and thinking about film as an important development of things that were happening long before that.
Yeah, so kind of a culmination of things as
Yeah,
well as
yeah.
a beginning of something new. Yeah.
But of course, these things, it didn't really culminate in terms of finishing anything. Obviously,
Yeah,
these similar ideas have moved on to the internet and virtual reality, new media. So those traditions and trajectories are still ongoing and relevant to today. In terms of the point about what was it, the influence of classical music on film?
yeah, and romantic music, and why did people turn to Wagner or other romantic composers? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the beginning of cinema history, of course, some people were very concerned to legitimate film and film studies as a valuable object of academic analysis and artistic practice. The second chapter of the book is really delves into the idea of taking the history of film music and the legacy of romantic music as a kind of case study in how discursive forces frame cinematic production as a legitimate form of artistic practice and scholarly analysis, basically, and how they appropriated the idea of Wagnerian symphonic form and operatic aesthetics to sort of legitimate film and to frame the practices of composers and critics and film theorists, and how those were it wasn't just a natural progression from Wagner did this. They framed Wagner as a kind of father of film music, but introducing Liszt into that discussion as a way of saying it wasn't just Wagner doing this. People have talked about the influence of Italian melodrama, Italian opera, American melodrama, and various other forms of classical music in the 19th century and popular culture as influence on film as well, not just Wagner and what he was doing with the Gesamtkunstwerk, but introducing Liszt as well as and his symphonic poem project as a way of just expanding the debate a little bit and adding something new as well. The symphonic poems are obviously these. There's the new genre of classical music that Liszt invented in the mid 19th century, when he would take an existing literary or aesthetic idea and then create a piece of single movement symphonic music that expressed that same poetic idea. So it was about trying to appropriate some of the values of language and expression and history and myth and add them into classical music. And then there are various connections to be drawn with film music from then, of course.
Yeah, it does seem to make have a strong maybe utility, or that idea has a strong kind of connection or utility when it comes to film music, where you're trying to illustrate something that already kind of exists.
Yeah.
Provide a soundtrack, as we now say. Yeah.
Some of the most characteristic aspects of classical cinematic music seem to come from that classical tradition as well, like the idea of Mickey Mousing, where a particular visual gesture or event is then mimicked by the soundtrack. That there's quite a strong prelude to that in the work of people like Richard Strauss as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, yes, yeah, yeah. It's funny. It was funny to read about that. A lot of the compositions you mentioned, I remembered from playing in high school in the band and orchestra in high school. So it was funny
Mm.
just how alive that tradition still, I mean, that music still is to, at least for my, I don't know, it's probably the same if you're, I mean, classical music doesn't change that much, I guess. So maybe people are still playing the same music, but it's funny, at least through my generation, we were still playing this. That type of music was very popular in high schools, the Richard Strauss and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The convergence of historical events there was quite sort of it kind of created this baptismal connection between the two. Basically, people still think of Hollywood today as this. You know, you go to the cinema, you see a film, it will have a score that draws on the history of European orchestral music. Obviously, there are exceptions, but because in that baptismal moment back in the 1920s and 30s, when sound was moving on to film, and they were making these soundtracks that fitted the particular um, stories being told, there was this. At the same time that classical music itself was moving away to more abstract and experimental forms with like Stravinsky and Schoenberg, Hollywood was appropriating the old romantic canon for its own purposes. So that's part of a reason why classical music wanted to move on to something different, because Hollywood was corrupting those old forms, perhaps.
Yeah, and then it seemed like Hollywood found a use for those new things as well, like atonal type music found its own
Mm.
kind of niche in certain uses in film music or spooky
Yeah,
scenes and stuff like that, which
Hollywood
is
will
interesting.
appropriate
Hollywood
everything given
keeps
to
like
them. Yeah,
devouring new innovations in art music.
absolutely. Probably the
um,
best example is the avant-garde music in The Shining, for example.
right. Yeah, I was thinking of movies like that. Yeah. Definitely. And yeah, maybe we can move on to Liszt, which I think was maybe the most, I mean, there's many interesting parts of your book to me. Probably the part that was like most powerful, I think, was your discussion of how Liszt fits into this, and especially how Liszt was portrayed in movies. So not only was his music used fairly commonly in movies and movie soundtracks, but he also was portrayed along with other romantic composers in films, which I thought was quite fascinating, and to look at the different types of films. So the more like Hollywood studio style of like biopic, I guess we call them, compared to something more. I don't know how you would describe Ken Russell, but um, yeah, how would you describe Liszt's move and maybe other romantic composers move into kind of the standard Hollywood style? Why was Hollywood trying to make movies of romantic composers, movies about romantic composers?
Well, for Hollywood, there was a particular cycle of films of composer biopics made in the 40s and 50s called the song films, and every studio seemed to have their own attempt to make a film in this tradition. You know, they would take the life of Schumann, Liszt, or Chopin, or Wagner, and make a big prestige Hollywood production, a lavish period drama based on the life of these composers. And primarily, it was a way of developing a more cultured audience, because after the Paramount decrees and so forth, the rise of television, Hollywood was fighting for new audiences, and so they were offering these lavish, big historical spectacles that television often didn't have the money to offer instead. So they were looking for ways of attracting audiences by looking at big, impressive historical spectacles that also, and they went for biblical epics for that kind of thing as well, but they were particularly focused with composers on building a sense of cultural legitimacy. They were saying, classical music is high culture, and cinema can offer, something for people who enjoy that kind of thing as well. So why Liszt in particular was the focus for this analysis of this subject, and it has been explored extensively by writers like John Tibbett.
Hmm.
Um, But the reason why Liszt in particular is useful as a sort of way to move into this discussion, apart from his connections I'm drawing throughout the book, is that Liszt, again, epitomizing certain elements of Romanticism, is this very eclectic figure. His cultural image, as I call it, pulls in so many different directions at once. The fact that he was this prototypical celebrity type of the touring musician, which is reflected today in the legacy of pop music and rock music stardom. But also at the other end of the spectrum, you've got him becoming an abbé, taking holy orders and becoming this isolated, venerable, spiritual artist, isolated in his ivory tower, basically. So there's a huge variety of representational tropes to draw on with Liszt, and it's a shame we only had room in the book for two major case studies, Song Without End and Lisztomania, but they do provide two pretty they epitomize both ends of the spectrum, basically, and there are examples scattered about things in between and uses of his music as well. But the fact that Liszt was so diverse and unusual as a composer gives him a real advantage for looking at these kind of debates, because composers like as colourful and interesting as someone like Wagner was, a lot of composers did have quite boring lives. You've got someone like Bruckner or Ravel. They don't make very interesting cinematic material, whereas Liszt, on the other hand, he's a very exciting and colourful character for Hollywood narrative.
Yeah, and you can filmmakers can find what they want in him. There's, like as you said, he's very diverse, and
Yeah.
yeah, I did watch the was it Song Without End? Yeah, I watched Song Without
Oh, good.
End.
Yes.
Um, yeah, it's interesting to look back on it and to compare it with Lisztomania. Yeah, Song Without End. I found it. I mean, it was a well-made movie. I found that has that Hollywood craft, the classic kind of studio craft behind it. So it's a really, well-made movie. It's beautiful. I have to say, I kind of got bored by the end of it.
That's completely understandable. Yes, it's not the most exciting film, I admit.
Yeah, so they found something they wanted in Liszt, I guess, portraying his development toward a more religious kind of persona. They do portray kind of his wild and crazy side to some extent, but it's more, the kind of the trajectory of the movie is, I don't know, how would you describe what they're trying to do in that movie, or like what parts of Liszt do you think they were emphasizing? I know you talk about this in the book.
Well, obviously, Song Without End is a very strange Liszt biography, primarily because of the casting. I think Dirk Bogarde is a really odd casting choice, and the fact that he's got this sort of James Dean style haircut or Elvis style haircut, rather than Liszt's iconic long hair, is very odd. And this is a good example of one of the major themes I'm developing throughout the book, is the idea of explaining things, audio visual representation as a form of explanation, and how various factors impact upon how things are explained to viewers and how they contextualize them and make sense of them. So the fact that, why did they change Liszt's hairstyle from the iconic image of him with the long white hair, in a later age at least, to the more modern sort of Bobby Soxer matinee idol look, obviously is to do with precisely that. It's to do with tying in with existing schemas of what people think of as a young, attractive, impressive artistic figure. So it maybe would have looked very strange and unusual to see Dirk Bogarde with the long hair, but it fits more in with. Obviously the thing is more pronounced with Roger Daltrey later in the Lisztomania film, because again you've got Dirk Bogarde and Liszt sort of melding together, forming a sort of hybrid figure where it's not entirely one, it's not entirely the other. They reflect back and forth, and of course there's a long discussion about how Dirk Bogarde was felt relatable with the Liszt character because he had that similar kind of matinee idol history as a young actor. So the dynamics between the choices made in representing something and how that affects historical representation, Hollywood films and well, films of all kinds are very interesting ways of looking at these kind of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, the casting choices in both Song Without End and Listomania are interesting. Yeah, and very different. It was, and I find it quite, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but by the time that Ken Russell was making Listomania, um, I mean, it was more, uh, at least acceptable among younger generations to have long hair again. So it's like the
Mm.
style had come back, at least for younger generations. This is something I talked about on a previous um, episode on my channel about how long hair was like a sign of rebellion after, well, during the 1960s, we'd had this, at least in the United States, there'd been a long period where short hair was kind of the norm. I think it was tied to the world wars and how it became a sign of just kind of like civic mindedness and patriotism and readiness to serve in the military, which had short hair for various hygienic reasons and so forth. So it was kind of normal for guys to have short hair. I think by the time Dirk Bogarde was playing, that was just 1960 or late 50s when they were making the movie. It would have been, I think, probably, I don't know if I can't remember if films during that time, historical films in the 50s, if people would have long hair. I'm trying to think of an example, but I'm not sure.
Wavy locks was the kind of thing, wasn't it? The kind of not long hair, but sort of don't know. I'd have to think of some examples, but yeah, you're right. There's definitely an interesting discussion to have about the changing ideas of fashion and their relationship with the values of youth and rebellion and that kind of thing. It's good to see that Liszt has a role to play in the history of youth hair length culture in the 20th century.
Yeah, yeah. So Listomania, the other film that we've already alluded to, maybe we should say a little more about that. I also watched Listomania, which I found more um, entertaining to me. I think some people will find it quite of a strange movie. Of course, a Ken Russell movie, if people know about Ken Russell, so it's sort of in some ways the typical Ken Russell movie, but I find it I mean, it's a very lively movie compared to something like Song Without End, which is more subdued, even though it shows some of Liszt's wild side. It's a more kind of level movie, I find, whereas Listomania is kind of like nonstop craziness, and which I just love the energy. And it's also, I feel romantic. I feel like Ken Russell was a romantic making a film about a romantic. I mean, that's why one thing I
Absolutely.
appreciate about the film. And what would you
He was
want to
he was
expand?
very self-conscious about that too. He was obviously he was a big lover of the romantic tradition, and his music was um, his sort of main love apart from film. He wanted to find a classical musical expression of making films. He writes a lot about this and how he was inspired in his approach to filmmaking by romantic aesthetics itself.
Yeah, and he made oops, sorry. I was just checking on something and made caused a little bit of a glitch. But let's yeah, keep going. So um yeah, he had made I wasn't able to find a kind of a version online, but he had made a film of Mahler, and I saw he made a film in the 80s about romantic writers, which I haven't had a chance to see yet, but it sounds at least interesting in concept. Um, yeah, so he was definitely into the romantic thing. We talked about cultural transcendence before, and I would relate what Ken Russell was doing to a kind of cultural transcendence. He's trying to do something new and pushing the boundaries and making things more and more extreme and just combining things that you wouldn't normally put together. The beginning of the film right away starts with kind of this duel between Liszt and the Count. Um, but you've got this kind of Western hoedown music, which is narrating what's happening. So you've got all these different elements um, combined together in just this rapid way, kind of constantly shifting way, which is something very different, of course, than what you got in those song films, like the composer biopics from the 50s and 60s, 50s mainly in Hollywood.
Absolutely. A big part of what makes that kind of thing romanticism is it's not so much the fact that there's a very complex question about whether romanticism is tied to a, the relationship with the past. Basically, there've been several interpretations of romanticism that have focused on its connection with the past, and how looking back at a romanticized, nostalgic conception of the past and appropriating old forms like the forms of silent comedy, classical Hollywood in Lisztomania's context, how they are definitive of romanticism. But I think the big lesson that Morse Peckham's conception of cultural transcendence teaches us is that it's not about the relationship with the past that's important for romanticism, but the relationship with the present, with what exists. It's about negating the current conditions of socioeconomic reality, rather than valuing the past for its own sake. The past, evaluation of the past and past forms and difference and melding old forms together is it's a method of negating the present. And I think that's a big, important element of romanticism that can sometimes be overlooked. And that's what I'm exploring with my new book projects as well, and not just our work on Peckham.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe I'll ask you about that as well. But yeah, it's worth emphasizing what you just said, that why romanticism remains relevant, and why you can see it as not just something that occurred during the kind of late 18th century through part of the 19th century, but that was kind of the first powerful, and you can see that early period as the first powerful instance of this negation of the present, as you say, that sort of the negation of conventional ideologies or explanations. And so I think that's why Ken Russell's film remains vital in a way, at least for those of us who like who feel ourselves tied to romanticism in some way, because it's I think even still today it's kind of surprising, even after, how many years has it been? Like 40, 50 years now?
Yeah.
Is that possible that it's been 50 years ago? 70?
Yeah, 75. So my maths is terrible. The reason I'm in arts and humanities is I can't do maths. Really, 5 + 5 makes my brain freeze sometimes.
Yeah, but decades ago, and it still seems pretty new to me. I mean, it reminds me of, I guess I was going to say it reminds me of the early Romantic writings, like early Wordsworth and Coleridge, early Carlyle, where it's just like, it's still kind of fresh, and today even. It's still can surprise you. It's not like much of what you are used to reading, used to experiencing. It still provides something new, even after 100 years in the case, more than 100 years in the case of the early Romantics, 200 years.
That sense of seeming fresh, seeming new, seeming different to anything we associate with that particular period is an interesting way into Romanticism. There's a quote that Stravinsky used about Beethoven's great fugue, the Grosse Fuge, if I'm a terrible German pronunciation, but he said it was a contemporary piece of music that would be contemporary forever. And that's an interesting way into thinking about why it would be this perfect romantic ideal, not only just to do with the thematic ideas of striving and insufficiency, but to do with the fact that it sort of stands out from the historical moment and doesn't seem to fit there or anywhere. There's a similar argument to be made about Ken Russell's things, perhaps, and also in terms of British cinema, something I've looked at in my second book, which is finished but not published yet, is Lindsay Anderson, who's a very similar director in certain ways, that kind of romantic sense of standing out and not fitting with his historical moment.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Do you pay much attention to kind of current filmmaking? I've heard, I don't pay that much attention anymore. I was much more interested in film when I was younger. I don't pay too much attention to newer films. I've heard some complaints that it's become like increasingly, I mean, the power of Hollywood studios is increasing and more. I mean, people, of course, can do independent stuff even easier maybe than they used to be able to do with digital stuff. I do hear complaints that kind of getting new, like unusual things seen is more of a problem because of just the way the streaming services are set up and the studios and all of that. Do you see any, are there any filmmakers, kind of contemporary filmmakers you see as continuing this tradition of people like Ken Russell or Lindsay Anderson or?
My focus has not been so much on contemporary cinema, but you're absolutely right in terms of, the idea of getting films made and seen today is easier than in the past because of advances in technology and social media and various forms of globalization that help these things along. But the fact that because the choice and the scope is growing so wide, it's getting harder and harder to find a big audience that makes your film successful. But of course, criticisms that Hollywood is harmful or dumbing down or not, doing sort of non-romantic, harmful things have been around since, Theodore Adorno was critiquing Hollywood for very similar reasons. I think that in terms of romantic films today, the place I would look is in films that are critical of capitalism. I think a big part of what makes Lindsay Anderson and the director I'm comparing him with, Arthur Penn, romantic in the way I explain it in the new book is the fact that their films are critical of capitalism, and that's not specific to them. Of course, there are loads of the other films that you could look at, but I'm developing an attitude, a new schema of romanticism that builds on Morse Peckham and what I've explained already in the first book about how romanticism is tied to the idea of capitalism as a kind of antagonist, and how they adopt concepts from each other and have a mutually determined relationship. So I think the dynamics between romanticism and critique of capitalism is an important element to look at in terms of cultural products these days.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, the critique of capitalism, of course. Yeah, in a way, it's an old idea. Of course, that's been around, kind of developed probably along with Romanticism in some ways in the 19th century as kind of the modern system was getting set up. Definitely people like Carlyle and other romantics were very critical of Romanticism. Of course, Marx in some ways was tied to Romantic philosophy, kind of responding to people like Hegel. Yeah, so it is an interesting through line, I guess, from 19th century Romanticism through to today.
The antagonism between Romanticism and capitalism was prefaced, I think, by Marx. He mentioned in again, my terrible German, Grundrisse, there's this idea about Romanticism being a kind of eternal antagonist of the forces of capitalism and how they'll hold each other in check. I'm not sure how extensively he develops it, but some writers like Michael Lowy and Robert Sayer have developed this. And but their approach, again, I'm critiquing that because it's tied to that conception of romanticism as being tied to a glorification of the past rather than negation of the present. So, yeah, these are still work in progress, but this is a question that I'm going to tackle with my second book, which is finished but not published yet.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, very interesting discussion, I think. Thanks for taking the time to talk. Again, the book was called Romanticism and Film. Some really interesting stuff in there, again, about the beginning of film and film music, how it relates to Romanticism, looking at the impact of people like Wagner on film music, and especially focusing on Liszt, which provides a really interesting kind of narrative, kind of looking at how Liszt appeared in early film music, and then how films were made about Liszt in different ways, bringing out different sides of Liszt, and kind of using Liszt for their own purposes or different kinds of purposes. So yeah, it's a really fascinating element of your book, and yeah, so thanks for taking some time to talk to me about it. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, no, I think that's covered a lot of the key points. And thank you very much for interviewing me for this. I've enjoyed this a lot, David. Thank you.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll do it again. We can sometime. We'll talk about one of your other books. All right.
Love to. Maybe we can talk about our book at some point in the future.
Book, of course, yes. So Will and I are writing a book together, so hopefully we'll talk about that as well.
On Morse Peckham. So
yes.
hopefully you'll be hearing more about him soon.